The ink-stained woman sitting in the corner of the saloon had become as much a fixture of paradise, Nevada, as the dusty street outside and the mountains rising in the distance. Penelope Voss had arrived in the mining town 6 months earlier with nothing but a worn leather satchel, a collection of pens, and the kind of education that made her an oddity in a place where most men couldn't write their own names. She had set up her little business in the Gold Dust Saloon, not because she enjoyed the smell of whiskey and tobacco, but because it was where the miners gathered after their shifts, their pockets heavy with pay and their hearts heavier with loneliness for families they had left behind in distant places. The afternoon sun slanted through the saloon's grimy windows as Penelope sat at her usual corner table, her dark hair pinned up in a practical bun that was already coming loose. Before her sat a burly miner named Joseph, his hands black with coal dust even though he had scrubbed them raw before coming to see her. He was dictating a letter to his wife in Pennsylvania, his voice cracking when he mentioned their daughter's upcoming birthday. "Tell her I remember," Joseph said, his accent thick with emotion. "Tell her I remember when she was born, how small she was, how she fit right in my hands. Tell her I will be home by Christmas, that I have saved nearly enough." Penelope's pen flew across the paper, translating his rough words into something more eloquent while keeping the heart of his message intact. This was her gift, the ability to take the feelings of these hardened men and put them into words that would make their loved ones feel cherished across the miles. She charged 50 cents for a letter, 25 cents to read one aloud for those who received replies. It was honest work, and it kept her fed and housed in a town where few opportunities existed for a woman alone. "That is beautiful," Joseph said when she read it back to him, his eyes wet. He pressed the coins into her palm and took the sealed envelope like it was made of gold. As Joseph left, Penelope stretched her fingers and glanced around the saloon. It was a Tuesday afternoon, slower than most days. The bartender, a man named Silas who had shown her nothing but kindness since her arrival, was wiping down the bar. A few card players occupied a table near the front, their voices low and steady. And there, standing in the doorway like he had materialized from the harsh Nevada sun itself, was a man Penelope had never seen before. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled the doorframe. Unlike the miners who usually sought her services, his clothes were clean, quality-made, the kind worn by someone who worked outdoors but had money to spend on good fabric. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but Penelope could see the strong line of his jaw and the way he held himself with a quiet confidence that was different from the swagger of the miners and drifters who usually passed through paradise. The man's eyes scanned the room and settled on her. He removed his hat, revealing hair the color of sun-bleached wheat and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray, like storm clouds over the mountains. He was perhaps 30 years old, maybe a year or two more, with lines around his eyes that spoke of a life spent squinting against sun and wind. He crossed the room with purposeful strides, his boots barely making a sound on the wooden floor despite his size. Penelope found herself sitting up straighter, suddenly aware of the loose strands of hair falling around her face and the ink stain on her right hand. "Miss Voss." His voice was deep, with a slight rasp that suggested he did not waste words on unnecessary talking. "Yes," Penelope replied, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Please sit down. Are you needing a letter written?" The man settled into the chair, which seemed smaller once he occupied it. He placed his hat on the table and studied her for a moment with those gray eyes. Up close, Penelope could see that his face was weathered but handsome, with a straight nose and a mouth that looked like it smiled rarely but genuinely. "My name is Marcus Dalton," he said. I own the Double D Ranch about 10 miles east of here. I have been hearing about you, about the work you do for the miners." "I write letters," Penelope said simply. "Nothing more complicated than that." "That is not what I hear. I hear you have a gift for words, that you can take a man's thoughts and make them into something worth reading." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his hands folded on the table. They were work-roughened hands, scarred and calloused but clean. "I am not needing a letter written. I am needing something bigger." Penelope felt her curiosity stir. "What exactly are you needing, Mr. Dalton?" "A story," he said. "My story. I want it written down proper-like, from the beginning to now. I want the truth of it preserved before it is lost or twisted into something it is not." She set down her pen, intrigued despite herself. "That is quite an undertaking. May I ask why? Are you planning to publish it?" Marcus shook his head. "Nothing like that. This is for my children, the ones I have now and any that might come later. I want them to know where they came from, what it took to build what we have. My father never told me his story, and when he died, all those years and experiences died with him. I will not make the same mistake." There was something in his voice, a quiet determination mixed with what might have been regret, that touched something in Penelope's chest. She had spent the last 6 months listening to the hopes and fears of men who worked themselves to exhaustion in the dark earth, but this was different. This was someone asking her to preserve a legacy. "That would take considerable time," Penelope said carefully. "More than a few hours. We would need multiple sessions, and I would need to ask you many questions to get the details right." "I am willing to pay fairly," Marcus said. $2 for each session, and I will provide transportation to and from my ranch, so you do not have to make the journey alone. We can work in the evenings, after my work is done for the day." $2 per session was more than Penelope usually made in a day. But it was not the money that made her pulse quicken slightly. It was the challenge, the chance to work on something more substantial than homesick letters. It was also, though she barely admitted it to herself, the way Marcus Dalton looked at her, like he saw a person of value rather than a woman alone in a rough mining town. "When would you want to start?" she asked. "Tomorrow evening, if you are willing. I can pick you up at 5 o'clock. "Where are you staying?" "Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, 2 streets over from here." Marcus nodded, committing it to memory. "I will be there at 5. Bring whatever supplies you need. This might take us a while." He stood, placing his hat back on his head. Before leaving, he reached into his pocket and placed $2 silver on the table. "For tomorrow's session, paid in advance." Penelope looked at the coins, then up at him. "I have not written anything yet." "No, but you agreed to try. That is worth something." His gray eyes held hers for a moment longer, and Penelope felt an unfamiliar flutter in her stomach. Then he nodded once and walked out of the saloon, disappearing into the bright Nevada afternoon as suddenly as he had appeared. Silas came over to her table, his eyebrows raised. That was Marcus Dalton, biggest ranch owner in the county. Heard his wife died in childbirth 3 years back, left him with a baby boy. He has been running that ranch alone ever since, raising his son and building his herd. Decent man from what folks say. Keeps to himself mostly. Penelope gathered the coins, her mind already turning over this new information. A widower with a young child, asking her to write his story. She wondered what had prompted this decision, what memories he carried that needed preserving. As she packed up her writing supplies for the day, she found herself looking forward to 5 o'clock tomorrow evening in a way that had nothing to do with the $2. The next day seemed to drag on forever. Penelope wrote 3 letters for miners. Read 2 letters aloud to men whose faces crumpled with joy at news from home, and tried not to watch the clock on the saloon wall. She went back to her boarding house at 4 o'clock to freshen up, changing into her better dress, a dark blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. She told herself this was professional, that she wanted to make a good impression on a client who was paying well, but her reflection in the small mirror told her she was lying. At precisely 5 o'clock, she heard the sound of a wagon outside. Penelope grabbed her leather satchel, now packed with extra paper, multiple pens, and 2 bottles of ink, and hurried downstairs. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house owner, was already peering out the window with undisguised curiosity. "That is Marcus Dalton, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice pitched high with interest. "What business do you have with him?" "He has hired me to do some writing for him," Penelope replied, keeping her voice neutral. "I will be back late this evening. You be careful, Miss Voss." A young woman alone with a man at his ranch. People might talk. "People in this town talk regardless of what I do," Penelope said, more sharply than she intended. "Good evening, Mrs. Henderson." She stepped outside before the older woman could say more. Marcus was waiting beside a well-maintained wagon, and he helped her up onto the seat with a gentle hand under her elbow. His touch was brief but warm, even through her sleeve. The drive to the Double D Ranch took them east along a dusty road that wound through scrubland dotted with sage and the occasional Joshua tree. Marcus did not talk much during the journey, but the silence was comfortable rather than awkward. Penelope found herself watching the landscape change as they moved away from the mining town, the mountains growing larger on the horizon, painted purple and gold by the setting sun. "It is beautiful out here," she said finally. Marcus glanced at her and she caught what might have been the ghost of a smile. "It is. That is one of the reasons I settled here. The land is hard, but it is honest. It does not lie to you about what it is." "How long have you had the ranch?" 8 years. "I started with nothing but a piece of paper saying I owned this land, and a handful of cattle I bought with every cent I had saved. Now, I have over 300 head and the best grazing land in the county." There was pride in his voice, but it was the quiet pride of someone who knew what his accomplishments were worth. The ranch came into view as they crested a small rise. It was more substantial than Penelope had expected, with a large main house built of wood and stone, a sizable barn, several outbuildings and corrals that held horses and cattle. Everything was well maintained, the fences sturdy, the buildings in good repair. This was not the holding of someone barely scraping by, but of someone who had built something lasting. A dog came running up as they approached, barking enthusiastically. Marcus quieted it with a word, and the animal fell into step beside the wagon, tongue lolling happily. "That is Scout," Marcus said. "Best cattle dog in Nevada, though he thinks he is still a puppy." As Marcus helped Penelope down from the wagon, the front door of the house opened, and a Mexican woman emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and kind eyes. "Miss Voss, this is Rosa. She manages my household and has been helping me raise my son since my wife passed. Rosa, this is Miss Penelope Voss. She will be coming by in the evenings to help me with a writing project." Rosa looked Penelope over with frank assessment, then smiled warmly. "Welcome, Miss Voss. It is good to see the patron doing something besides working every hour of the day. Come inside. I have coffee ready and some biscuits." The inside of the house was clean and comfortable, with simple but solid furniture and touches that spoke of a woman's hand that had been absent for some time. The main room had a large fireplace, a dining table, and several chairs. Books lined one wall, more than Penelope would have expected to find on a ranch. "You read," she observed, gesturing to the books. "When I have time," Marcus replied. My mother insisted I get proper schooling even though we did not have much money. She said ignorance was a choice, not a circumstance. I can read and write well enough, but I am not good at putting things down the way they should be said. That is why I need your help." A small boy, perhaps 3 years old, toddled out from one of the back rooms, making a beeline for Marcus with the single-minded determination of a child who had been waiting for his father. Marcus scooped him up with easy affection, and the boy wrapped his arms around his father's neck. "This is Thomas," Marcus said, and his whole face softened when he looked at his son. "Thomas, this is Miss Voss. Can you say hello?" The boy was shy, hiding his face against Marcus's shoulder, but he peeked out at Penelope with gray eyes exactly like his father's. She smiled at him. "Hello, Thomas. It is very nice to meet you." "He will warm up to you," Marcus said. "He does not see many new people out here. Rosa, can you get Thomas ready for bed while Miss Voss and I get started?" Rosa took the boy, who went willingly enough, and Marcus led Penelope to the dining table. She set out her supplies while he poured coffee for both of them, and then they sat down across from each other in the lamplight. "Where would you like me to start?" Marcus asked. Penelope uncapped her ink and poised her pen. "At the beginning. Tell me about your childhood, your family. Help me understand where you came from." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his coffee cup cradled in his hands, and began to speak. His voice was steady as he talked about growing up in Missouri, the son of a farmer who worked land he did not own. He spoke of a childhood marked by hard work and harder times, of a mother who taught him to read by candlelight after full days of labor, of a father who drank too much and died young, leaving debts that cost them everything. Penelope's pen moved across the page, capturing not just his words but the emotion beneath them. She asked questions, drawing out details, helping him paint pictures with his memories. How old was he when his father died? 12. What did his mother do after they lost the farm? Took in sewing, cleaned houses, did whatever she could to keep them fed. How did he end up in Nevada? "I left Missouri when I was 17, Marcus said. Mama had remarried by then, a good man who could provide for her better than I could. I wanted to find my own way, make something of myself. I heard about the silver strikes in Nevada and thought maybe I would get lucky. I did not find silver, but I found something better. I found this land." "Tell me about that," Penelope urged. "How did you find this place?" Marcus's eyes took on a faraway look. "I was working as a ranch hand for a man who owned a spread north of here. He was not a good boss, worked us hard and paid little, but I learned everything I could. One day I was out looking for strays and I came over that rise, the same one we crossed coming here today, and I saw this valley. The grass was green, there was water from the spring, and the mountains stood guard over it all. I knew this was where I was meant to be." He told her about filing his claim, about the years of backbreaking work to build the ranch from nothing. He spoke matter-of-factly about sleeping in a dugout the first winter, about eating beans and salt pork for months on end, because that was all he could afford, about the time a mountain lion killed 3 of his calves, and he spent 2 weeks hunting it down. The hours slipped by unnoticed as Marcus talked and Penelope wrote. She found herself fascinated not just by his story, but by the man telling it. There was a quiet strength in him, a steadiness that was rare. He did not boast or embellish. When he talked about his successes, it was with gratitude rather than pride. When he mentioned his failures, he did so with the acceptance of someone who had learned from them. Finally, Rosa appeared in the doorway, stifling a yawn. "Patron, it is past 10 o'clock. Perhaps Miss Voss should be getting back to town." Marcus looked startled, as if he had lost track of time. "Of course. I apologize, Miss Voss. I did not mean to keep you so late." "Do not apologize," Penelope said, flexing her cramped fingers. This is wonderful material. We have made excellent progress." As she gathered her supplies, Marcus disappeared into one of the back rooms and returned with a thick shawl. "The nights get cold. You can borrow this for the ride back." The shawl was wool, well made and warm. Penelope wrapped it around her shoulders, catching a faint scent that she realized was Marcus himself, a mixture of leather and sage, and something she could not quite name. It was not unpleasant. The ride back to paradise was quieter than the ride out had been. The moon was nearly full, painting the landscape in silver and shadow. Penelope found herself stealing glances at Marcus's profile, at the strong line of his jaw, and the way his hands held the reins with easy competence. "When should I come back?" she asked as they neared the town. "Wednesday evening, if that suits you. Same time." "That suits me fine." When they reached the boarding house, Marcus helped her down from the wagon again, his hands spanning her waist for just a moment. Penelope felt the warmth of them even through her dress and the borrowed shawl. "Thank you for today," Marcus said. "You have a gift for this, for making a man's rough words sound like they mean something." "They do mean something," Penelope replied. "You lived an interesting life, Mr. Dalton. It deserves to be recorded properly." He handed her the $2 for the next session, and their fingers brushed in the exchange. Even that brief contact sent a small shock up Penelope's arm. "Until Wednesday, then," he said. "Until Wednesday." Penelope watched him drive away, the wagon disappearing into the moonlit night. She stood there longer than necessary, the shawl still wrapped around her shoulders, before finally going inside to face Mrs. Henderson's inevitable questions. Wednesday could not come fast enough. Penelope threw herself into her regular work, but her mind kept drifting back to the ranch, to Marcus's story, to the way he had looked at her in the lamplight. She told herself she was being foolish, that this was simply a professional arrangement, but her heart knew better. When 5 o'clock Wednesday arrived, she was waiting outside with her satchel, wearing the same blue dress. Marcus pulled up right on time, and the small smile he gave her when she climbed up beside him made her stomach flutter. They fell into a pattern over the following weeks. Twice a week, sometimes 3 times, Marcus would pick her up and drive her to the ranch. They would sit at his dining table while Rosa tended to Thomas, and Marcus would talk while Penelope wrote. He had moved beyond his early years now, telling her about meeting his wife, Catherine, at a church social in Virginia City. She was the daughter of a mine owner, Marcus said, his voice soft with memory. "I had no business courting her. I was nobody, just a ranch hand with dreams bigger than my pocket. But she saw something in me, I guess. She believed I could make something of myself." "Tell me about the courtship," Penelope said, even though part of her did not want to hear about his love for another woman. But this was his story, and it needed to be told completely. Marcus's face took on a gentle expression Penelope had not seen before. "I courted her for a year. Her father did not approve, thought she should marry someone with money and position. But Catherine was stubborn. She told him she loved me, and that was that. We married as soon as I had saved enough to buy this land and start building the house. She was barely 20 years old." "Was she happy here?" Penelope asked quietly. "I think so. She knew it would be hard living out here away from town, but she never complained. She helped me build this ranch, worked alongside me when times were tough. She sewed all the curtains, planted a garden, made this house a home." He paused, his hands tightening around his coffee cup. "She wanted a large family, 4 or 5 children. She got pregnant right away and we were so happy, but the birth was difficult. The doctor from Paradise did not make it in time, and Rosa and I did what we could, but Catherine lost too much blood. She held Thomas for about an hour, told me she loved me, made me promise I would give him a good life, and then she was gone. Penelope's eyes stung with tears. She reached across the table without thinking and placed her hand over his. "I am so sorry." Marcus looked down at their joined hands, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then he turned his hand over so that his palm was against hers, his fingers curling around hers gently. "It has been 3 years," he said. "The pain is not as sharp as it was, but there is still an emptiness. Thomas keeps me going. He needs his father, and I will not fail him the way my father failed me." They sat like that for a long moment, hands joined across the table. Finally, Penelope reluctantly pulled away and picked up her pen again. "Should we continue?" They worked for another 2 hours, moving through the difficult years after Catherine's death, the struggle of running a ranch while caring for an infant, the slow process of healing. When it was time for Penelope to go home, Marcus walked her out to the wagon and they stood together in the cool night air. "Thank you for listening," he said. "It helps talking about it. I have kept it all inside for so long." "That is what I am here for," Penelope replied, though she knew it was becoming much more than that. The weeks turned into a month, then 2. The story was taking shape beautifully, but it was also becoming clear that something else was growing between Penelope and Marcus. They began arriving at the ranch earlier, and Marcus started showing her around the property before they settled down to work. He taught her about cattle ranching, about reading the land and the weather. He introduced her properly to his horses and let her feed sugar cubes to his favorite mare, a gentle bay named Honey. Thomas grew comfortable with her too, toddling over to show her his toys or climbing into her lap during their writing sessions. Penelope found herself growing attached to the serious little boy with his father's gray eyes. She brought him small gifts from town, a wooden horse 1 week, a colorful ribbon the next. Rosa noticed, of course. She had noticed from the beginning if her knowing looks were any indication. One evening when Marcus went outside to check on something in the barn and Thomas was already in bed, Rosa poured Penelope a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. "You care for him," Rosa said simply. It was not a question. Penelope felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I care about doing good work." "You know that is not what I mean. I see how you look at the patron, how he looks at you. I have not seen that light in his eyes since Miss Catherine died." "It would not be proper," Penelope said quietly. "I am his employee." Rosa made a dismissive sound. "You are a woman and he is a man, both of proper age, both alone. What is not proper about that? Life is too short for such foolishness. I know this. I lost my own husband to a mining accident when I was younger than you. I thought I could not love again, but I did." "Love comes when it comes, Miss Voss. We do not get to choose when or with whom." "He loved his wife very much," Penelope said. "Yes, he did, and she would want him to be happy again. She was a good woman, Miss Catherine. She would not want him to spend the rest of his life alone, raising their son without a mother, working himself into the ground. She would want him to love again." Before Penelope could respond, they heard Marcus's footsteps on the porch. Rosa stood and gathered the coffee cups, giving Penelope a meaningful look before disappearing into the kitchen. The turning point came on a Tuesday evening in late October. Penelope had been working with Marcus for nearly 3 months, and his story was almost complete. They had reached the present day, the point where his narrative caught up with reality. As they finished reviewing what she had written, an uncomfortable silence fell between them. "That is it then," Marcus said finally. "That is my story, up to now." "It is a good story," Penelope replied, stacking the papers neatly. "Your children will be proud to read it someday." "There is one more thing I want added," Marcus said. His voice was different, tighter, like he was working up courage for something. "Something that is happening right now, that needs to be part of the story." "What is that?" Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness. I want you to write about a man who thought he was done with love, who thought that part of his life was over. A man who hired a woman to write his story and found himself falling in love with her instead. Penelope's heart stopped, then started again, beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. Marcus. He turned to face her, and the expression on his face was raw and vulnerable. I know it is improper, that you probably do not feel the same way, that I am just a rancher with a small child and too much land and not enough polish. But Penelope, these last 3 months have been the best I have had in 3 years. Not because of the story, but because of you. Because of the way you listen, the way you laugh when Thomas does something silly, the way you look at the mountains when the sun sets. I am in love with you, and I needed you to know that before you leave here tonight and maybe never come back. Penelope stood on shaking legs. You think I might not come back? I would not blame you if you did not. I am asking for more than you signed on for. She crossed the room to stand in front of him, looking up into those storm-gray eyes. Marcus Dalton, you are possibly the most foolish, intelligent man I have ever met. Do you really think I have been coming out here twice a week just for $2 a session? Do you really think I dress in my best dress and fix my hair special just for a work assignment? Hope flickered across his face. Then you feel it too. I am in love with you, Penelope said, and saying the words aloud felt like breaking through ice into warm water. I have been falling for you for weeks now, maybe from that very first day when you walked into the saloon and asked me to write your story. I love your strength and your honesty. I love how gentle you are with Thomas, how hard you have worked for everything you have. I love who you are. Marcus reached out and cupped her face in his work-roughened hands. Penelope Voss, may I kiss you? You had better, she whispered. He kissed her softly at first, almost tentatively, as if he could not quite believe this was happening. Penelope rose on her toes and wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him back with all the feelings she had been holding inside for months. Marcus pulled her closer, deepening the kiss, and Penelope felt like she was coming home to a place she had not known she was seeking. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Marcus rested his forehead against hers. I want to marry you, he said. I know that is fast, that we should court properly, but I am too old and too tired to play games. I want you here in this house, as my wife. I want Thomas to have a mother and for us to fill these empty bedrooms with more children. I want to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life. Penelope laughed, tears streaming down her face. That is the worst proposal I have ever heard. Is that a no? That is a yes, you impossible man. Yes, I will marry you, yes to all of it. Marcus kissed her again, lifting her clear off her feet in his enthusiasm. They were both laughing when he set her down, giddy with joy and relief and the pure rightness of it all. The door to Thomas's room creaked open and the little boy appeared, rubbing his eyes. Papa! Marcus scooped him up. Thomas, how would you like it if Miss Voss came to live with us? If she became part of our family? Thomas looked at Penelope with serious consideration, then reached out his small arms to her. She took him from Marcus, and the boy laid his head on her shoulder with the trust of a child who knew he was loved. I think that is a yes, Marcus said softly. They told Rosa the next morning, and the older woman clasped her hands together with delight. Finally. I have been waiting for you two to realize what was obvious to everyone else. When is the wedding? As soon as possible, Marcus said, looking at Penelope. Unless you want a big ceremony, Penelope shook her head. I have no family to invite, no friends except the minors I write for, and they would feel out of place at a fancy wedding. Small and simple suits me fine. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Paradise, with Rosa and Silas the bartender as witnesses and Thomas standing between them, holding a small pillow with the rings tied to it. Penelope wore a new dress in cream-colored wool that Rosa had helped her sew, and Marcus wore his best suit, his hair neatly combed and his boots polished to a shine. The preacher, an elderly man named Reverend Walsh who rode a circuit between several small towns, performed the ceremony. When he pronounced them man and wife and Marcus kissed her, Penelope felt a completeness she had not known she was missing. Thomas clapped his hands with delight, and Rosa dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. They had a small dinner at the ranch afterward, just the four of them and Silas, who brought a bottle of good whiskey as a wedding present. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Marcus took Penelope's hand and led her outside. "I want to show you something," he said. They walked to the top of the rise where Marcus had first seen the valley all those years ago. From here, the ranch spread out below them, the house glowing with lamplight, the barn solid and reassuring, the cattle moving slowly through the pastures. "This is all ours now," Marcus said. "Yours and mine together. Everything I have worked for, everything I have built, I want to share it with you." Penelope leaned against him, his arm coming around her shoulders. "I brought nothing to this marriage but myself." "You brought everything that matters. You brought love and laughter and the promise of a future I had stopped believing in. You brought hope, Penelope. That is worth more than all the cattle and land in Nevada." They stood there as the stars came out one by one until the sky was full of them. Later, much later, they went back to the house, to the bedroom that was now theirs, and made their marriage real in the way of men and women since the beginning of time. Life settled into a new rhythm after the wedding. Penelope moved her few possessions from the boarding house to the ranch, turning the room that had been Catherine's sewing room into a study where she could write. She continued taking jobs from the miners, but now Marcus would drive her into Paradise twice a week, waiting while she conducted her business in the saloon, then driving her home again. Home. The word still gave Penelope a warm feeling every time she thought it. She had not had a real home since her parents died when she was 16, leaving her to make her way in the world with nothing but her education and her wits. She had lived in boarding houses and rented rooms, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. But the Double D Ranch was different. This was where she belonged. She threw herself into making the house truly theirs. She sewed new curtains for the windows, bright yellow ones that let in the sunlight. She planted bulbs in the garden for spring flowers. She learned to cook from Rosa, gradually taking over more of the household duties while the older woman transitioned into a grandmother role with Thomas. Thomas flourished with a mother's attention. He followed Penelope around the house, chattering in his toddler way, helping her with small tasks. She read to him every night, teaching him his letters even though he was still very young. Marcus would often find them curled up together on the sofa, Penelope's melodious voice reading some story while Thomas listened with rapt attention. "You are good with him," Marcus said one evening after Thomas had gone to bed. "He is easy to love," Penelope replied, "just like his father." "I hope you still feel that way when you are heavy with your own child and chasing after a rambunctious 4-year-old, Penelope smiled. They had not yet started their own family, though not for lack of trying. It had only been 3 months since the wedding, still early days. But she wanted it, wanted to give Marcus more children, wanted to see what a child who was part of her and part of him would look like. Winter came to Nevada, cold and occasionally harsh. Snow fell on the mountains but rarely in the valley, though the wind could be bitter. Marcus worked long hours keeping the cattle fed and healthy, and Penelope worried about him when he came in with his face red from cold and his hands stiff. "You need to take better care of yourself," she scolded, pulling off his frozen gloves and warming his hands between hers. "I am fine." The cattle need tending regardless of the weather. The cattle will still be there tomorrow. You are no good to anyone if you freeze to death." He smiled at her concern and kissed her cold nose. "Yes, wife, I will try to come in earlier tomorrow." Christmas came, and Penelope made it special for Thomas, decorating a small pine tree that Marcus cut from the mountains and baking cookies with Rosa's help. They gave Thomas a rocking horse that Marcus had carved himself, working on it in secret in the barn for weeks. The boy's face when he saw it made all the effort worthwhile. On Christmas night, after Thomas was asleep and Rosa had gone to her own small house near the barn, Marcus and Penelope sat by the fire. He gave her a present wrapped in brown paper, and when she opened it, she found a leather journal, beautifully made with her initials tooled into the cover. "For your own stories," Marcus said. "You spend so much time writing for others, I thought you might like something for yourself." Penelope traced the letters with her finger, touched beyond words. "It is perfect, thank you." She gave him her gift, a warm sheepskin coat she had purchased in Virginia City on one of their trips to the larger town. It had cost more than she should have spent, but Marcus needed a good winter coat, and she wanted him to have the best. He tried it on immediately, and it fit perfectly. "How did you know my size?" "I measured one of your other coats when you were out working. Rosa helped me with the shopping. I love it, and I love you, Penelope Dalton." Hearing her married name still gave her a thrill. "I love you too." Spring came slowly to Nevada, teasing them with warm days followed by cold snaps. But gradually the land warmed, grass greened, and Penelope's bulbs pushed through the soil and bloomed. It was also in spring that Penelope realized she had not had her monthly courses in quite some time. She told Rosa first, needing another woman's confirmation of what she suspected. Rosa hugged her tightly and promised to help with everything. That evening, when Marcus came in from moving cattle to a new pasture, Penelope met him at the door with news that made him swing her around in a circle, laughing with joy. "A baby," he kept saying. "We are going to have a baby. In the fall, I think. September or October, if I am calculating right." Marcus placed his hand on her still flat stomach with wonder. "Thomas is going to be a big brother." They told Thomas the next morning, explaining as best they could to a 3-year-old that there would be a baby in the house later in the year. Thomas seemed more interested in the bacon Rosa was frying than in the announcement, but he patted Penelope's stomach and said, "Baby," which they took as understanding. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Penelope had some morning sickness in the early months, but nothing terrible. As her belly grew, Marcus became even more protective, insisting she not overwork herself, carrying anything heavy, treating her like she was made of glass. "I am pregnant, not dying," Penelope said with exasperation after he refused to let her hang laundry. "I know, but I cannot help worrying." After what happened with Catherine, Penelope took his face in her hands. "I am not Catherine. Every woman, every pregnancy is different. I am healthy and strong, and I am going to be fine. We are both going to be fine." But she understood his fear, so she let him fuss over her and did not complain when he limited her activities. She used the extra rest time to write in the journal he had given her, recording her thoughts and feelings about the baby, about their life together, about the love that had transformed her from a lonely woman writing letters in a saloon to a rancher's wife expecting her first child. She also continued her work with the miners, though she limited her trips to town to once a week now. The men were happy for her, these rough characters who had shared their deepest feelings with her over the months. They brought small gifts, a tiny knitted cap from Joseph, who had learned his wife was expecting again too, a wooden rattle carved by a Norwegian miner who missed his own children terribly. Summer was hot and dry. Penelope grew large and uncomfortable, and Marcus worried constantly about the lack of rain and what it would mean for the fall grazing. But in early September, storms finally came, drenching the parched land and turning everything green again. Penelope went into labor on a Tuesday evening, 2 weeks earlier than expected. Rosa sent Marcus racing for the doctor in Paradise while she got Penelope settled and started heating water. Thomas, sensing something important was happening, stayed close to Rosa's side, his eyes wide and serious. Marcus returned with the doctor in record time. Dr. Harrison was an older man who had delivered hundreds of babies in his career, and his calm competence helped ease Marcus's visible panic. Rosa shooed Marcus and Thomas out of the bedroom, and the long night began. Labor was hard, painful, exhausting. Penelope understood now why women feared childbirth, why Catherine had died in this same house trying to bring Thomas into the world. But Dr. Harrison was experienced and patient, and Rosa held her hand through the worst of it, encouraging her, telling her she was doing well. Finally, as dawn was breaking over the mountains, Penelope gave one last tremendous push and felt the baby slip free. A moment of silence, then a lusty cry filled the room. "You have a son," Dr. Harrison announced, holding up a squalling, red-faced infant. "A healthy, strong boy." Rosa cleaned the baby while the doctor tended to Penelope. When they finally placed the baby in her arms, Penelope felt a rush of love so intense it took her breath away. He was perfect, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably turn gray like his father's. Marcus was allowed in, and he came slowly, his face pale with worry until he saw Penelope sitting up, tired but smiling with their son in her arms. He sat on the edge of the bed, and Penelope placed the baby in his arms. "Meet your son," she said softly. Marcus looked down at the tiny face and tears rolled down his weathered cheeks. "He is perfect. You are perfect. Thank you, Penelope. Thank you for this gift." Thomas was brought in to meet his baby brother, and he peered at the infant with great interest. "Baby," he announced firmly. "That is right, Thomas. This is your baby brother. We are going to name him Matthew." "Matthew Dalton," Marcus said, trying out the name. "Matthew James Dalton, after my grandfather." Little Matthew slept in his mother's arms, unaware of the love surrounding him, unaware that he was the second chance his father had prayed for, the hope made flesh. The months after Matthew's birth were exhausting but joyful. Penelope was tired in a way she had never been before, but the bone-deep satisfaction of nursing her child, of watching Marcus with their son, of seeing Thomas gently pat his baby brother's head, made every sleepless night worthwhile. Marcus was a devoted father to both boys. He would walk the floor with Matthew when the baby was fussy, singing old songs in his rough voice. He continued to spend special time with Thomas, making sure the older boy did not feel pushed aside by the new baby. Thomas took his role as big brother seriously, always wanting to help, bringing Penelope diapers before she even asked, showing his brother his toys. As Matthew grew from newborn to infant, the ranch prospered. The fall rains meant good grazing, the cattle were healthy, and Marcus was able to sell his stock at top prices. He used the profit to build a larger barn and to hire 2 ranch hands to help with the daily work, acknowledging that he could not do everything alone anymore, not with a family to think about. The ranch hands, 2 brothers named Jack and William who had come west from Texas, lived in a bunkhouse Marcus built near the barn. They were good workers, honest and reliable, and they fit into the ranch life easily. Rosa's daughter, who was widowed and had been living in Virginia City, moved back to Paradise with her own 2 children. And suddenly, the ranch felt like a real community rather than an isolated outpost. Life settled into a comfortable pattern. Penelope largely stopped taking work from the miners, though she still occasionally did a letter for one of her old regulars. She was too busy with Matthew and Thomas, with managing the growing household, with being Marcus's wife and partner. 2 years after Matthew was born, Penelope found herself pregnant again. This time she was less nervous, knowing what to expect, though Marcus's worry levels went through the roof all over again. Their daughter, Margaret Rose, named for Marcus's mother and for Rosa, who had become a beloved grandmother figure, was born on a beautiful May morning with far less drama than Matthew's birth had involved. With 3 children now, the house that had once seemed too large and empty was suddenly full of life and noise. Thomas was 6 years old, and Marcus had started teaching him to ride. Matthew was a rambunctious toddler getting into everything. Baby Margaret was peaceful and content, happy to be passed around among her family members. Penelope sometimes stood in the doorway of the house, watching Marcus play with the children in the yard, and marveled at how much her life had changed. 5 years ago she had been alone in the world, writing letters for homesick miners in a saloon, unsure of her future. Now she was a wife and mother, part of a family, living on a thriving ranch in Nevada with a man who loved her more than she had thought possible. Marcus often did the same, pausing in his work to watch Penelope with the children or tending her garden, and feeling a gratitude that sometimes made his chest tight. He had thought his chance at happiness died with Catherine, that he would spend the rest of his life as a lonely widower doing his duty, but never again knowing joy. Penelope had proven him wrong in the best possible way. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Marcus took Penelope back to the rise where he had proposed, leaving the children with Rosa for the evening. They stood together looking out over the ranch as the sun set. "You remember when I asked you to write my story?" Marcus said, his arm around her waist. "Of course. You walked into that saloon looking so serious and determined. I thought you were going to rob the place at first." Marcus laughed. "Did you really?" "For about 2 seconds. Then you took off your hat and I saw your face and I knew you were not dangerous, at least not in that way." "What way was I dangerous?" "To my heart," Penelope said softly. "I knew from that first day that you could hurt me if I let myself care about you, but I let myself anyway." "I am glad you did. You gave me back my life, Penelope. You gave me love and hope and a future worth living. You gave me more children and made Thomas's life better. You made this house a home. I cannot imagine what my life would be if you had said no that day, if you had refused to write my story." "I would never have said no. That story brought us together." "Speaking of the story," Marcus said, pulling a sheaf of papers from his coat pocket, "I have been adding to it, writing about everything that has happened since we got married, since the children were born. I am not as eloquent as you, but I wanted our whole story preserved, not just the first part." Penelope took the papers and flipped through them, seeing Marcus's careful handwriting filling the pages. Her eyes blurred with tears as she read passages about their courtship, their wedding, the births of their children. "These children," Marcus had written in one section, "are the evidence of a second chance I never thought I would receive. Thomas has a mother who loves him as if she had borne him herself. Matthew and Margaret will grow up in a home filled with love and laughter. And I have a partner, a true partner, who makes every day better just by being in it. If I had never hired Penelope Voss to write my story, I would have missed out on the greatest chapter of my life." "Marcus," Penelope whispered, clutching the papers to her chest, "this is beautiful." "I learned from the best," he said, kissing her forehead. "You taught me that words matter, that writing things down preserves them for the future. I want our grandchildren to read this someday and know that love can happen more than once, that second chances are real, that loss does not have to mean the end of happiness. They stayed on the rise until the stars came out, talking about the future, about the children they had and the ones they might have yet, about the ranch and their dreams for it. When they finally went back to the house, their hands were clasped tightly together, two people who had found each other against the odds and built something lasting. More years passed, bringing more changes. Thomas grew into a tall, serious boy who loved the ranch and was clearly going to follow in his father's footsteps. Matthew was the wild one, always climbing things he should not, always getting into mischief, keeping everyone on their toes. Margaret developed into a gentle soul who loved animals and had a gift for gentling even the most nervous horse. Penelope had two more children, another son they named Samuel, and a daughter they named Emily. The house rang with children's voices, with laughter and occasional squabbles, and the organized chaos of a large, happy family. Marcus expanded the ranch, buying adjacent land when it became available, increasing his herd to over 1,000 head. The Double D became known as one of the most successful ranches in the county, but Marcus never forgot where he came from, never lost the humility that hard years had taught him. He was generous with neighbors who fell on hard times, fair with his employees, honest in all his dealings. Penelope had long since stopped writing letters for the miners, but she had started something new. She began teaching the ranch hands and any of the miners who wanted to learn to read and write. What started as lessons for Jack and William expanded into a small school that met twice a week in the bunkhouse. Men who had lived their whole lives in ignorance learned to sign their own names, to read simple books, to write letters to their families without needing to hire someone to do it for them. "You are giving them a gift," Marcus said, watching her work patiently with a grizzled miner who was learning his letters at 50 years old. "The same gift my mother gave me, the ability to think and communicate and understand the world. Everyone deserves to read and write," Penelope said. "It should not be a privilege of the wealthy." When Thomas was 14, Marcus asked Penelope if she thought it was time to show their son the story she had written all those years ago, the one that had brought them together. Penelope agreed, and that evening after dinner, Marcus called Thomas into his study. "Son, I have something I want you to read," Marcus said, pulling out the leather-bound manuscript that Penelope had carefully compiled and bound years earlier. It had grown considerably, with the additions Marcus had made over the years. "What is it?" Thomas asked. "It is the story of this family. It starts with my childhood, goes through the years of building this ranch, talks about your mother Catherine and how much we loved each other. And then it tells the story of how I met Penelope, how we fell in love, how you got a new mother and brother and sisters. I want you to read it and understand where you come from, who you are." Thomas took the manuscript reverently and started reading that night. It took him several days to finish it, and when he did, he came to find Marcus and Penelope together in the kitchen. "I finished the story," he said quietly. His eyes were red like he had been crying. "It is beautiful. Thank you for writing it, for wanting me to know everything." Penelope hugged him tightly. "You are part of this story, Thomas, one of the most important parts." "I do not remember my birth mother very well," Thomas admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "Just little bits and pieces, the smell of her perfume maybe, or the sound of her voice singing. But you have been my mother for as long as I can really remember, Mother Penelope. You are the one who raised me, who taught me right from wrong, who loves me. I am grateful for that, and I am grateful that Father found you." It was the first time Thomas had called her anything other than just Penelope, and hearing mother from him made Penelope cry. Marcus put his arms around both of them, and they stood there in the kitchen. a family bound not just by blood but by choice and love and shared history. The years continued their steady march. Thomas eventually married a girl from Paradise, a smart and kind young woman named Sarah, and they built a house on the western edge of the ranch property. Thomas worked alongside Marcus, learning every aspect of running the ranch, gradually taking on more responsibility as Marcus got older. Matthew proved less interested in ranching and more interested in engineering. Marcus and Penelope sent him to school in California, and he eventually got a job working on railroad construction. He came home twice a year, full of stories about building bridges and laying track through impossible terrain. Margaret married a veterinarian who set up practice in Virginia City, and she helped him with his work, proving to have a natural gift for healing animals. Samuel took over Penelope's teaching work, expanding it into a proper school that met in a building Marcus had constructed for that purpose. Emily was still young, only 10 years old, with her whole future ahead of her. On a warm evening in late summer, when Penelope was 42 and Marcus was 51, they sat together on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the mountains as they had done thousands of times before. Their bodies showed the years of hard work and child-rearing, but their love had only deepened with time. "You ever regret it?" Marcus asked suddenly. "Giving up your independence to marry me and live out here. You could have done so much, traveled, maybe even published your own writing." Penelope looked at him in surprise. "Regret? Marcus, this is the life I was meant to have. I have published writing, the most important writing in the world. I wrote your story, our story, and it has shaped this family. I taught dozens of men to read and write, giving them tools they never had before. I raised 5 children who are good, decent people. I helped build this ranch into something that will last for generations. How could I possibly regret any of that? I just want you to be happy. I am happy. Deliriously, completely, utterly happy. You gave me a home, Marcus. You gave me a family and a purpose and a love I never dreamed I would find. That day you walked into the saloon and asked me to write your story was the luckiest day of my life." Marcus took her hand, his thumb rubbing across her knuckles in the familiar gesture he had done 10,000 times. "Mine too. I thought I was asking you to preserve the past. Instead, you gave me a future." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and stars began to appear. Inside the house, they could hear Samuel practicing his reading lesson for tomorrow's class, and Emily playing the piano Marcus had bought her for her last birthday. The sounds of their family, of the life they had built together. "I should probably update the story again," Marcus said. "Add in the last few years, the weddings, the grandchildren." Penelope smiled. "Or we could do it together this time, make it truly our story written in both our voices. I would like that." So they began a new ritual, sitting together after dinner several nights a week, taking turns writing new chapters in their ongoing story. They recorded Thomas and Sarah's wedding, the birth of their first grandchild, Matthew's successes with the railroad, Margaret's happiness with her veterinarian husband. They wrote about Samuel's school and the young men who were learning to read, about Emily's musical talent and her dreams of studying in San Francisco. The manuscript grew and grew, no longer just Marcus's story but the story of an entire family, of a ranch that had been built from nothing, of love found in the unlikeliest of places. Years turned into decades. Marcus's hair went completely gray, then white. Penelope developed lines around her eyes and mouth from years of smiling and laughing. Their children grew into adults with children of their own. The ranch prospered under Thomas's management, and he proved to be as capable as his father had been. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party. The house was full of people, children running everywhere, grandchildren climbing on Marcus's lap, daughters and daughters-in-law helping prepare food in the kitchen, sons and sons-in-law talking about cattle and crops and the future. Rosa, now ancient but still sharp as ever, presided over the festivities like the family matriarch she had become. As the party wound down and the last of the guests departed, Penelope and Marcus found themselves alone on the porch again. The night was clear and cool, stars scattered across the black sky like diamonds. 30 years, Penelope mused. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we have always been together. I feel the same way. I cannot remember a time when you were not part of my life, even though I lived more than 30 years before I met you. What do you think Catherine would say if she could see us now? It was a question Penelope had never asked before, though she had wondered it many times. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering. I think she would be happy, he said finally. Catherine loved me and she loved Thomas. She would want us both to be happy and cared for. I think she would thank you for being the mother to Thomas that she could not be, for giving him siblings and a stable home. I think she would be glad that I did not spend the rest of my life alone and bitter. I hope so. I have always felt grateful to her, even though I never met her. She gave you Thomas and she made you the man you are. I built my life on the foundation she helped create. Marcus pulled Penelope close, and she rested her head on his shoulder. I was blessed twice, he said. 2 good women who loved me. Not many men can say that. They stayed out on the porch until late, talking about the past and the future, about their children and grandchildren, about the changes they had seen in Nevada and the world. The mining boom had largely passed Paradise by, leaving it a quieter place than it had been during Penelope's first years there. The ranch remained successful, adaptable to changing times and markets. We should make sure the story is finished, Penelope said suddenly. The whole story, right up to now, just in case. In case of what? In case something happens to one of us. We are not young anymore, Marcus. I want to make sure everything is recorded, that our grandchildren and great-grandchildren know the whole story. So they spent the next several months working on the manuscript, adding final chapters, making sure nothing important was left out. They wrote about the struggles and triumphs of 30 years of marriage, about watching their children grow and have families of their own, about the satisfaction of building something lasting. Marcus wrote a final section addressed to his descendants, whoever they might be. This story, he wrote, began as a way to preserve my own history, the history of a poor boy from Missouri who came west and made something of himself. But it became much more than that. It became the story of a family, of a love that transformed everything, of second chances and new beginnings. If you are reading this, you are part of this story. You carry the blood of people who worked hard, loved deeply, and never gave up no matter how difficult things became. Remember that, honor that, and know that you are loved even by ancestors you never met, because we built all of this for you. Penelope added her own note at the end. I came to Nevada a woman alone, with no family and no real future beyond scraping together enough money to survive. Marcus Dalton gave me everything, not because he was rich, though the ranch did well. Not because he gave me things, though he was always generous, but because he gave me himself, his trust, his love, his life. He gave me children and a home and a purpose. In return, I gave him the same. That is the secret to a good marriage, I think. 2 people giving everything to each other, holding nothing back, building something together that is greater than either of them could build alone. If you find that kind of love, hold on to it with both hands and never let go. It is the most valuable thing in the world. They had the manuscript professionally bound in San Francisco, 3 copies made, One for Thomas, one for Matthew, and one for Margaret. Samuel and Emily would receive theirs later when they were older and ready to appreciate it. The children received their copies at a family gathering that Christmas. There was not a dry eye in the room as Marcus and Penelope explained what they were giving them, the complete story of the family written over 30 years. "This is incredible," Thomas said, carefully turning the pages of his copy. "This is our legacy preserved forever." "That was the idea," Marcus said. "We wanted you to know where you came from, who your people were, not just the facts but the feelings behind them." Life continued in its steady way. Marcus gradually turned over more and more of the ranch operations to Thomas, though he still went out every day to check on the cattle and the land he loved. Penelope's teaching had become the foundation of a real school that served all the children in the area, not just the ranch hands learning to read. She had given up the actual teaching to younger people, but she supervised and helped plan the curriculum. They had achieved something rare, a true partnership that lasted, a love that weathered time and hardship and came out stronger. They had their disagreements over the years, of course. What couple did not? But they had learned to fight fair, to listen to each other, to remember that they were on the same side. On a spring morning, when Penelope was 55 and Marcus was 64, Marcus did not come down for breakfast. Penelope found him still in bed, his face peaceful, but he did not respond when she shook his shoulder. The doctor confirmed what she already knew in her heart. Marcus had died in his sleep, his heart simply stopping during the night. The grief was crushing. Even though they had been blessed with 33 years together, it was not enough. It would never have been enough. Penelope felt like half of herself had been torn away, leaving a raw wound that ached with every breath. The funeral was enormous. It seemed like everyone in 3 counties came to pay their respects to Marcus Dalton, the rancher who had built an empire from nothing, the employer who treated his workers fairly, the man who had helped his neighbors in tough times and asked nothing in return. But for Penelope, it was simpler. She had lost her husband, her partner, her love. Thomas and Sarah stayed with her for the first few weeks, and their presence helped. The grandchildren helped too, their innocent joy and constant needs providing distraction from the grief. But eventually, they had to return to their own home and their own lives, and Penelope was left alone in the house that had been so full of Marcus's presence. She wandered through the rooms like a ghost, unable to settle, unable to find peace. She slept in their bed on his side, trying to catch some lingering scent of him. She sat in his chair, touched his clothes hanging in the closet, reread the story they had written together. It was the story that finally helped her begin to heal. Reading about their life together, about the love they had shared, about the family they had built, reminded her that while Marcus was gone, his legacy lived on. He lived on in Thomas, and the way he ran the ranch with his father's integrity. He lived on in Matthew's determination, and Margaret's kindness, and Samuel's intelligence, and Emily's joy. He lived on in the dozen grandchildren who carried his blood and would pass it on to their own children. And he lived on in the story, preserved forever in words, just as he had wanted. Penelope began to find purpose again. She returned to her work with the school, pouring her energy into making sure every child in the area had access to education. She spent time with her children and grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather, making sure they knew him even though some of them were too young to remember him clearly. She lived for another 15 years after Marcus's death, dying peacefully in her sleep at the age of 70, surrounded by her children. They buried her next to Marcus on the rise overlooking the ranch, the place where he had first seen the valley and where they had shared so many important moments. At the funeral, Thomas stood before the assembled family and read from the story his parents had written together. His voice was strong and clear, as he read about a lonely woman writing letters in a saloon, about a rancher who asked her to write his story, about two people who found love when neither was looking for it. "They built this family," Thomas said, looking out at the crowd of children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. "They built this ranch. They built a legacy of hard work and integrity and love. We honor them best by living the values they taught us and by never forgetting their story." The manuscript was carefully preserved and passed down through the generations. Children grew up hearing about their great-great-grandparents, about Penelope who had traveled to Nevada alone and made a life for herself, about Marcus who had built a ranch from nothing. The story inspired some to pursue education, others to value hard work, all to believe in the possibility of love and second chances. The Double D Ranch continued to thrive for generations, always staying in the family, always run with the integrity Marcus had insisted upon. The school Penelope had started grew into a proper institution, educating children throughout the county. The small cemetery on the rise overlooking the valley, filled with markers bearing the names Dalton and Voss and others who had married into the family. And through it all, the story remained, a testament to two people who had found each other against the odds, who had built something lasting, who had loved deeply and completely. It was a story of the American West, of hard work and determination, of loss and love and second chances. But most of all, it was a story about two people who had been willing to take a chance on each other, to be vulnerable, to build a life together one day at a time. That story, written in ink on paper, bound in leather and passed down through the years, became more valuable to the family than all the land and cattle and money. It was their foundation, their heritage, proof that ordinary people could do extraordinary things if they had courage and love. And somewhere, perhaps in whatever place souls go after death, Penelope and Marcus were together again, looking down on the family they had created, on the legacy they had built, satisfied that they had done what they set out to do all those years ago in a saloon in Paradise, Nevada. They had preserved a story, they had created a family, they had found love, and in the end, what more could anyone ask for?